take as many as you want, actually, for colleagues and friends. And we're particularly pleased to have such a outstanding panel this morning, a outstanding group of speakers who are going to comment on the report, and more importantly than the report, really the future of U.S.-Mexico relations at a very critical time in our nation's history and in the relationship between our countries. This report was the idea of the Woodrow Wilson Center Institute Advisory Board, chaired by Jose Antonio Fernandez and Roger Wallace. We started talking about this probably 8 or 9 months ago, and were able to convene a series of working groups in the fall, 4 working groups, to talk about security cooperation, economic integration, migration, and border management. We felt it was a critical time to begin putting some ideas out and to convening people who had ideas. These are not ideas of the Wilson Center, they're ideas of people we got together, but put ideas out about the future of the relationship, what's possible. At a time when there was a renewal in the U.S. government, we had no idea who would be the next president at the time, of course. The document is not a document of consensus. We had over 100 people, policymakers, academics, journalists, people from civic and business organizations, experts in different fields who participated in the meeting, some of them as formal members of the working groups, some of them as, and several of you are here in the room, and some people as special guests, people who for their political positions, their government positions, or they were journalists, could not be part of the formal decision-making process, but were as actively engaged in the debate. We did not reach consensus, and I should say this is not a consensus report. It also does not represent an official position of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Woodrow Wilson Center does not take positions on issues. But 5 of us sat down and tried to write up as best we could what was the major findings of each of the groups. We sent it back to the groups. We had an ongoing back and forth to try and reach as much as we could of a general understanding. And I think for the most part, what was achieved, there's some comments in the back where people wanted to, as they say in Spanish, matizar, give a little bit of nuance to the positions. But generally speaking, I think there's not consensus, but certainly a degree of, I think we found common issues that people were comfortable with on both sides of the border. Then let me recognize Eric Olson and Dolly Esteves and Robert Donnelly, and David Ayon, who's not here, the other 3 are here, who were part of the writing of this report, the different sections. Let me just say very quickly something about the report, and then I'll turn it over to others to talk about it. The report has a single major argument, which is that we don't need more policy towards Mexico. There's a lot of policy. And those of us that are, the chattering classes, as they say, talk often about, how there's not enough attention to our regions of the world. Actually, in the case of Mexico, there is a lot of attention. One of our major arguments is that embedded in almost every agency in the U.S. government, embedded in almost every office in Congress, there is attention to Mexico on some issues. Mexico is both foreign policy and domestic policy. It is unlike almost every other relationship in the world in that sense. What there isn't sometimes is enough strategic thinking. And so the question is not how we think more about Mexico, but how we can think more strategically about issues that matter for both countries, and where working together and cooperating in a more coordinated manner will yield better results for people in both countries. And we looked at these 4 issue areas where there are a number of areas where it's particularly important to cooperate with each other. Let me take one example of this, which is in the media a lot today, which is organized crime. In organized crime, there's actually a lot of things that we're working on together. There's a lot of initiatives on both sides of the border where we're doing things individually. One of the things that we argue, and Eric wrote this chapter, is that we need a comprehensive approach to dealing with organized crime. This is an issue that really is shared between both countries. I mean, it has a component which has to do with the weakness of institutions in Mexico, but it has a component which has to do with consumption in the United States and with trafficking of arms and money from drug sales in the U.S. back to Mexico. You cannot deal with the issue of organized crime unless you deal with all of those component parts. Those component parts end up requiring different agencies in the U.S. government that don't always talk to each other, different agencies in the Mexican government that don't always talk to each other, and different levels of government, state and local government. And so the question is, how can we be more strategic in getting together people who deal with money laundering, with people who deal with arms trafficking, with people who deal with the demand side, with people who deal with the law enforcement side, with people doing judicial strengthening in Mexico? How do you get those component parts working together in a much more effective way? Because this is an issue that really matters for both countries significantly. This is not to say this does not go on. It does go on. In fact, in the past few months, we've even seen a great deal more coordination. But it's the kind of area where we could do a lot more to be much more coordinated and benefit citizens on both sides of the border. Just jumping through a few points very quickly. On the border, we talk a great deal about the need for border infrastructure. We talk about a lot of things there. Environmental infrastructure, crossing points, the kind of things that make the quality of life in border communities much better, that make them economically successful, and that also help both countries by facilitating trade and the crossing of people through legal checkpoints. This has been a critical ongoing problem. There's a real chance with a stimulus bill in both countries to do something about this, to put a little bit of effort into the question of border infrastructure. And there's obviously a need within this, which does not take money, but takes a little bit of political will to figure out how we can speed up the permit processes that often take 15 years to get infrastructure approved. So the kinds of things where strategic thinking is necessary more than large sums of money to make it happen. On economic integration, we spent a great deal of time. Dolia Esteves wrote that chapter. Robert wrote the chapter on the border. Dolia wrote the chapter on economic integration, trying to bridge the debate between trade and development, between those who are NAFTA supporters and NAFTA skeptics. I'm not sure we solved that debate. I'm not sure we reached a resolution, nor did we try to. But I think that there are some ideas in here, some policy options that talk about how you move from trade to development. How can you do both in different ways? Not everyone agrees with all of them, but it's something worth looking at. During the time of economic crisis, probably the most important thing is how do we continue to talk to each other and consult so we don't make things worse for each other along the way. But once a crisis has passed, how can we be creative in efforts that allow us to move from simply being good trading partners to being good partners that really look strategically how we strengthen each other's development. And finally, migration. We certainly do not propose going back to the whole enchilada. That said, there are lots of other ways that we could be talking with each other about migration that we're not. We went exactly the other direction over the past few years after 9/11 and other things that happened along the way. And so how can we regain a conversation about migration, recognizing that most of what we have to do on immigration reform has to be done in this country? Most of what has to be done to give people opportunities not to migrate has to be done in Mexico. But that there are ways that we can be working together with each other to facilitate each other's efforts on this. And there's some very specific, David Ayon wrote this chapter, some very good suggestions in here that came out of the group in terms of how we start that conversation and what we should be talking about. The bottom line of all this is that we do not expect Mexico to be on the president's agenda 24/7 or any cabinet secretary's agenda 24/7. And likewise, it won't be on Calderon's agenda 24/7 in the United States, nor any cabinet secretary in Mexico. The question is not we need to spend lots of time thinking about each other, but when we do think about the issues in the relationship, how do we coordinate these much more effectively, much more strategically, in ways that really benefit citizens on both sides of the border? It is what the ambassador frequently calls moving from checkers to chess, from playing checkers with each other to actually thinking sort of at a strategic game where we're thinking ahead of how the moves matter down the road. And with that, let me introduce the ambassador of Mexico, Arturo Sarucán, a good friend of the Wilson Center, a member of our advisory board, and very pleased to have you with us. A few remarks.
Good morning. Morning, Andrew. Today, I'm in the fortuitous role of being the monkey to the organ grinders who are the members of the panel, who will obviously bear the brunt of the discussion of the report, and I was asked to give some opening remarks. I think, number one, obviously all of us understand how timely the report is, and I want to congratulate not only the Mexico Institute, but all of those who worked assiduously over the past months in ensuring that we had a blueprint of some of the issues that these two countries need to look at as they work together and look down the road and work with one another. It's timely also because I think it tries to regain the critical importance of a need of strategic direction in the relationship, which was probably lost or which has probably been lost since the 90s, where Mexico and the United States decided to negotiate NAFTA. I think a certain sense of strategic need, importance, drive was lost, and I think this report and a new administration in the United States can help regain that thrust. It's also timely because I think those were precisely the terms of reference with which then President-elect Obama and President Calderon discussed the relationship when they met a week before President Obama was sworn in. It was precisely the need to build a strategic partnership between Mexico and the United States, which sort of was the leitmotif of their 2.5-hour discussion in the Cultural Institute. And here I'm doing a bit of an infomercial and trying to show off that President Calderon was the first president who sat down with President Obama. But it was I think a very good first discussion of the challenges and the opportunities that these two leaders will face the next 4 years as we seek to propel the relationship forward. But it's also timely because of some of the reports and punditry that have been out there recently suggesting that Mexico is a failed state. I will not go into why I think that the analytical premises of some of these reports are absolutely flawed. I don't think they're based in plausibility or probability, which are two of the key elements that you need to build into any game playing or prospective scenario, which is what some of these reports were trying to do. But let me just highlight or underscore this. I find it a bit contradictory that while some in certain media are suggesting that there is a failed state south of the US border, today we have a Woodrow Wilson report suggesting that a strategic relationship needs to be built with Mexico. You don't build strategic relationships with failed states. So I think the report in itself, the fact that a report has come out suggesting some of the parameters that are in this report, is a fine rebuttal to some of these theses that have been thrown out there. Some of them with a high degree of irresponsibility, some of them by outfits seeking a juicy deal with contractors in Mexico. So, as Andrew said, I think the report has a host of ideas and of premises. I think its greatest asset is that it dares to be bold. And there are certainly things in the report with which we may not all agree. There are specific items in each one of those chapters which I may not agree with, and I'm sure that the panelists will certainly not agree with some of the recommendations in the report. But I think that the idea is that it is laying out a blueprint of what is feasible, possible to be able to build in this relationship. It's also clear that there are some things in the report which both countries will be able to do together, either synergistically, cooperatively, in tandem, but there are many other issues in which the heavy lifting will have to be done in Washington, D.C. or in Mexico. For example, in the United States, an immigration system that makes sense, stopping the flow of guns which are feeding the power of the drug syndicates in Mexico, pushing back on some of the nativist or neo-mercantile protectionist tendencies which are springing up in here as we debate everything from the stimulus package to how the United States will take on some of the challenges of revitalizing the Doha round, or how we build upon the success of NAFTA. And other things and other heavy lifting will have to be done in Mexico. How does Mexico trigger the type of economic development that will prevent 300,000 women and men from crossing that border without papers every year into the United States? How do we continue to try and reform institutions so they can withstand the scourge of organized crime and the debilitating effect of endemic corruption? Or how do we continue deregulating Mexico's economy so that we can grow at faster rates than the ones that we have been growing for the past 10 years? The report, I think, also recognizes what I would suggest are the 5 main strategic drivers of this relationship as we move down the road. And I will bundle them artificially into 5, and some of these issues are clearly stated and spelled out in the report. The first one is border security. How do these two countries continue to build upon what they've been achieving in terms of border security? How do we ensure that the border is secure on both sides, both to deter potential terrorists from trying to use the border to undermine the security of either nation, or against the scourge of organized crime, operating again on both sides and in both directions? The second one is trade and border facilitation. How do we ensure that we have the border infrastructure that will allow us to continue to compete? That as we build an intelligent border that allows both sides to put in the means and the measures we need to have the proper surveillance on that border, that we build in doors that allow for the free flow of goods and services, that we don't shut down the border because of what we're doing in the security realm. The third one is this double helix of energy and the environment. And here I think we have 2 very young presidents, President Obama 47, President Calderon 46, who have clearly put the issue of environmental degradation right in the front of their domestic agendas, and that agreed in their meeting 3-4 weeks ago in Washington to precisely lead together on the issue of environmental degradation and how you bind energy security, energy availability with alternative sources of energy, with green policies along our borders, with green trade corridors. This will be, I think, a very important driver in the bilateral relationship as we move forward. The fourth one is social well-being and prosperity. And this means everything from fixing what does not work today in terms of immigration flows and labor mobility between both our countries, and which, again, as Andrew and I have said, things will need to be done on this side of the border, things will have to be done on the Mexican side of the border, but certainly at some point we will have to come together to solve some of the dynamics that are triggered by population flows across the border. But also start looking forward. How do we take into account that today Mexico is the country with the largest expat community of Americans living abroad? Almost 1 million Americans live in Mexico today. And what is that doing not only to the cross-border dynamics of population flow, but how do we work with baby boomers retiring in Mexico who will need access to medical facilities and health care? Can we work to certify hospitals in Mexico so that insurance on this side can allow baby boomers in Mexico to receive their medical attention and health care in Mexico? There are a lot of synergies in this area where I think we're trying to find a way to move the relationship forward. And finally, the last strategic drive in the relationship, how Mexico and the United States work together both within the hemisphere and around the globe. Mexico, as some of you in the room know, has now just assumed its 2-year tenure as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. I think this will allow both countries a unique opportunity to work together during the first 2 years of the administration of President Obama and his foreign policy agenda, and will allow Mexico and the United States to work together to find potential synergies on a host of issues within the region and around the world, which should allow Mexico and the United States to provide common footprints on those issues where we have common perceptions on global and regional challenges. These are some of the things that I find extremely interesting in the report. I'm sure that from the panelists we will hear an in-depth discussion on many of these issues, and I certainly look forward to seeing this report being discussed, debated, talked about, and hopefully analyzed in many of the policy centers, think tanks, and universities of which many of you in this auditorium belong to. So, Andrew, thank you, congratulations, and Godspeed on the report.
Thank you, Ambassador. Before we turn over to the panel, let me recognize Katie Putnam, by the way, who put this event together. You'll see her translating shortly, and Travis Hyde and James Zamaripa, who helped us put this together as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Ginger Thompson, who we were very fortunate to have as the moderator today of this panel. Let me thank all the panelists for joining us. I know some of you came at great personal difficulty. If I can recognize Ambassador Davidow, who literally flew overnight to be with us. We very much appreciate that. And we're just very fortunate to have this group here. I think we're going to see some fresh thinking. Let me say that Ginger Thompson, you have her bio here, is has been a reporter in Latin America for over a decade. She was the bureau chief of the New York Times. She's won the Maria Moores Cabot Prize and was part of a Pulitzer Prize winning team as well. She's now a national correspondent with the New York Times. Ginger, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. It's really great to see so much interest in this topic. There's so many people who think, Washington, or for Washington, Mexico has fallen off the radar, and I would suggest that this crowd today indicates something different. We're here again at another important crossroads in the relationship between Mexico and the United States. In the last decade, we've watched both countries make presidential history that many thought was inconceivable, at least in our lifetime. In 2000, Vicente Fox became the first defeated the longest ruling party in the world. And 3 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago now, Barack Obama became the first African-American elected president of the United States. Mr. Fox's plans for changing Mexico's relationship with the United States were foiled largely by the events of 9/11. and President Bush, who started his time in office as one of the most, or considered a great friend to Mexico, ended his time as unpopular south of the border as he was north of it. There's still not a clear sense of what or how President Obama plans to change Mexico's relations with the United States. We didn't get a lot of clues from President Calderon's visit to Washington. There's been a lot of talk and perhaps even more wishful thinking about a more engaged relationship, a more respectful tone, a more strategic partnership. Some, however, are not sitting around waiting for pronouncements from the White House. Seated on this stage, as well as out there in the audience, are people who from their own platforms have begun to put together a series of proposals for how to turn these goals for a more strategic partnership into reality. We're going to start by hearing from those who are on this stage, and later we'll also invite comments and questions from you. It's my pleasure to introduce this prestigious panel, although I suspect that many are already well known to most of you. Jeffrey Davidow is the president of the Institute of the Americas, which is based in La Jolla, California. His career at the State Department spanned 34 years. He held senior positions in U.S. embassies in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Guatemala, and Chile. And he served as United States Ambassador to Venezuela in '93 and in Mexico from 1998 to 2002. He's the author of 2 books, including one titled The United States and Mexico, or The U.S. and Mexico, The Bear and the Porcupine. Lázaro Cárdenas Batel is a resident public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center, where he is working on a project on how immigrant associations have become agents for political change in Mexico and the United States. He served as governor of the state of Michoacán from 2002 to 2008. And prior to that, he served as a senator and a congressman. He's a member of the Left of Center Party of the Democratic Revolution, or the PRD. Denise Dresser is quite simply one of the most prominent voices of political opinion in Mexico. She is author of numerous publications on Mexican politics and U.S.-Mexico relations, and has published articles in the Journal of Democracy, Current History, and the Harvard International Journal of Press and Politics. She's done book reviews for Foreign Policy and writes a political column for the weekly Mexican newspaper Reforma. She also writes for the weekly Proceso and is a frequent commentator on Mexican politics in the U.S. and Canadian media. And she has time for a real job. She's a professor of political science at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, and she has taught comparative politics, political economy, and Mexican politics since '91. Andrés Martínez is directs the New America Foundation's Bernard L. Schwartz Fellows Program. Martinez was the editorial page editor of the Los Angeles Times for nearly 3 years, beginning in September of 2004, and also presided over the newspaper's op-ed page and its Sunday opinion section. He previously served as an assistant editorial page editor at the New York Times and was a member of the editorial board from 2000 to 2004. He's a native of Mexico and a 2004 Pulitzer Prize finalist for a series of editorials on the impact of U.S. farm subsidies on the developing world. So, madam and gentlemen, we're here to talk about a report that's produced by the center that's hosting us today, and I'd like to begin by asking each one of you to give sort of a 5-minute commentary on your thoughts about the report. And if we can, I'd like to begin with the governor, with the former governor, Mr. Cárdenas.
Thank you, Ginger. Good morning. First of all, I want to thank Andrew Seeley and the Mexico Institute for inviting me to take part in this presentation, and also for the opportunity to participate in the 4 working groups on U.S.-Mexico relations. It is an honor for me to share this panel with Denise Dresser, Jeffrey Davidow, and Andres Martinez. Ambassador, contrary to what many people assume, relations with Mexico are of the utmost importance for the United States, as the report we are presenting today correctly points out. What happens in Canada or in Mexico inevitably has an impact in this country. The security of its neighbors is the security of the U.S. Mexico is the second destination for U.S. exports. The competitiveness of various U.S. economic sectors relies upon Mexican labor, as does the progress of many individual regions within the country. Poor environmental management on either side of the border inevitably affects the neighboring areas. For Mexico, relations with the U.S. are also fundamental. And yet, what is missing is a different perspective to the bilateral relationship, one built on interdependence, co-responsibility, and mutual benefit. Perhaps it is the lack of this spirit that makes some people jump to the conclusion that the bilateral relationship is not a priority. Many people in the United States view Mexico as the source of the problem, rather than part of the solution. And some go to the extreme of branding it as a failed state, in the same category as Pakistan or Somalia. This narrow and unilateral vision is also quite common in Mexico. The United States is frequently seen as the culprit of our problems, or as the escape valve which allows us to avoid taking responsibility for the lack of investment and jobs in the country. It is essential to build a common understanding for each one of the transborder issues. There can be no strategic alliance if there is no joint assessment and strategy in relation to the bilateral issues. It is impossible to defeat drug trafficking, for example, if we do not see it as a transnational issue, where each one of the two countries must do its part at home. The United States must commit to restraining the traffic of arms to the south and seriously reducing its consumption of drugs. Migration flows are a clear reflection of the income and development gap between our two countries, as well as a picture of the deep interdependence of our economies. Unilateral approaches have no use in this case either. The United States must keep the Mexican perspective in mind as it faces many issues which are often considered strictly domestic. Mexico, on the other hand, is not a failed state, as some have suggested, but it should consolidate its institutions. It must prevent them from being captured by those whom the state ought to combat or regulate. We must do this not only to confront organized crime, but also all the current challenges that we face as a nation, including the possibility of reducing the development gap which separates Mexico from the United States. We are in the midst of the most serious economic and financial crisis in decades, while the United States is involved in two wars. However, during these critical times, the need to redraw our bilateral relationship becomes especially clear. Along with many others here in the US and around the world, we are expecting something different from Barack Obama. His election represents a major cultural victory of the American people and a reconciliation of this country with its own diversity. Outside the United States, Mexico included, sympathy for Obama was largely a product of the hope that the U.S. would change its way of relating to the world. We are well aware that President Obama cannot manage all issues at the same time, and that even the President of the United States has limitations on its power. He must be cautious, but at the same time, for many reasons, he must move with audacity to make a difference. Almost a year ago, on the campaign trail, then Senator Barack Obama said, "As President, I will work to advance the common prosperity and security of all the people of the Americas. That work must begin with a renewed strategic partnership with Mexico. I will repair the strained relationship with our southern neighbor. We hope so. Finally, I would like to highlight the seriousness of the work undertaken by the Mexico Institute. As Sandro said, around 100 people from the two countries participate in the working groups, people from very different professional profiles and ideological backgrounds. The report is an excellent example of what can be achieved when you listen to and take into account those people who have a different perspective. We may share or not some of the specific points that are outlined in the document. However, to the extent that we heed the elementary lesson derived from the report, that all matters pertaining to the bilateral relationship need to be addressed from a perspective of interdependence and shared responsibility, we will have taken a great step forward in our relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Lázaro. Now, if you would, Ambassador Davidow. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ginger, ladies and gentlemen, friends, Mr. Ambassador. I'm pleased to be in Washington. And I'm always quite attentive to language when I come back to Washington and how people speak here in this somewhat foreign country. And when Andrew says and then repeats again that this is not a consensus report, I have visions of attempted homicides and broken marriages and Lord knows what else. Actually, I recommend this report to you. It's well done. It's full of commonsensical, realistic suggestions that take into consideration the political realities of the time. And when one reads the report in the very centrist orientation of it, one can understand that there probably were people on these committees that felt that their perspectives that lay somewhat outside the center were not given sufficient due. But the essential feeling that I got reading the report and its analysis is that the U.S.-Mexico relationship is stuck in the mud. It lacks oomph. It lacks drive. No, for sure, there have been and continue to be important and new developments, the Merida Initiative being one that we all know and we'll probably talk about more. But so much of the relationship and its institutions are in bad shape. U.S. immigration system is broken. I don't know anybody who doesn't think that's the case. NAFTA is not providing the kinds of returns, at least an increase of trade and commerce, that it did in its initial years. That process has slowed. Still very valuable, but it's not rendering much more today than it did last year or what have you. The institutions that have been created either through NAFTA or over the years, the BEC, the Labor and Environment Commissions, NADBank, the whole range that all of you know about, seem to me to be, with some exceptions, either moribund or ineffective. And another fact which is indisputable, the border in its centrality in the movement of people and goods is totally dysfunctional, and I perhaps am more aware of that because I live on the border. In a simpler time, all of this could have been taken by a new president to unveil a flashy new initiative. I think of Siempre Amigos, and with a lot of hand-holding and great photo sessions, a good deal of mariachi music. But, you know, I think we're too jaded. We're too skeptical. We're too experienced. And more than anything else, we are too preoccupied in this country and in Mexico. So let's not go for the flash and filigree. And I think the sense of this report is, let's look at the doable. Much can be done. I like most of the recommendations. Let me offer about a half a dozen other thoughts, some of which support the report, some of which go beyond, and some of which are quite general and some somewhat specific. On the general side, what policymakers must guard against, and opinion leaders, is to not allow this immensely complicated, rich, convoluted relationship to be reduced to one issue. This has happened before in terms of public perception. During most of the 1990s, actually back into the 1980s, for the American public, there was only one issue as it related to Mexico, and it was narcotics. And that then became the center focal point of the discussion about the U.S.-Mexican relationship in Mexico, the whole certification process, what have you, that we lived through. We moved out of that, but then at the beginning of this century, in around 2000, but then the entire fabric of the relationship was reduced again to one issue, which was immigration. Immigration in terms of desires by the Mexican government and the Mexican community in the United States to see changes in our system, which desperately needs change, and a reaction, a nativist reaction in this country. So if you said Mexico 3 or 4 years ago, there was only one word response: immigration. And now I fear that we are moving in the same direction, and the topic is violence. And this has led serious people to, well, perhaps not so serious people, but has forced serious people into a discussion about the failed state and what that means and so forth and so on. Underneath this mono-issue culture, there is always a tremendous fabric and web of activity and cooperation. But by focusing on just one issue and allowing the discussion to be reduced, it makes progress on everything difficult. So this is where leadership and political leadership is necessary, because for our leaders in this country and for leaders in Mexico, it's easy just to talk about violence. That's where the questions come from. That's what the press is asking about. It's the easy story. And a conscientious effort must be made to continue to place in front of the American people the entire variety of this relationship. So that's a general comment that I would make. Specific comment, and I speak here from total and abject ignorance, which I've always found served me well. Let's make sure we have our mechanisms and personal contacts well in place to handle any financial crisis or surprise. You know, back at the last major financial crisis in Mexico, 1994, one of the most frightening elements of that, which occurred at the end of the year, Christmas season and so forth, is that people in the new Mexican government at that point really didn't know who to call in the U.S. government. They didn't have those ties. They didn't have the phone numbers. And that really added to the nature of the crisis. Now, things have changed. First, we have very experienced people at work. Augustine Carstens, Larry Summers, Geithner. And we have established mechanisms, swaps, ability that are in place so that literally without much work, Mexico could probably pick up $3 billion in Washington and with one phone call to help in a financial crisis. But what is happening in Mexico is troubling. The devaluation of the peso, which has been quite abrupt and significant, is something to be concerned about. And I just say, let's make sure we have what we need in place if we're going to be facing something more critical than we are now. Third, let's not be afraid to look at NAFTA. NAFTA itself has become almost iconic, both in the positive and negative sense. And I think during the last presidential campaign and in popular discussion before and after, NAFTA doesn't mean a trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It means all of this goddamn globalization and losing jobs to the Burmese and God knows what else. And because we have not, those of us in government, and this has been standard since the first Bush administration, Clinton, the second Bush administration, a real commitment to NAFTA, we've really been afraid, I think, to look at it in a serious way. What has it accomplished? You know, beyond the statistics we all throw around, what promise has it fulfilled and what hasn't fulfilled? What negative elements have emerged from it? I do not favor renegotiating NAFTA. That would be an absolute disaster. It cannot be passed again in either Mexico or the United States. But let's look at some of these elements. During the campaign, under pressure, particularly during the primary campaign, candidate Obama made some comments, as all of the candidates, Democratic candidates did, about, yes, we must study this, we must look at it, we must at least talk strongly about this. And I'm not mocking him in any way. It is a concern. So let's look at what could be done. And I favor, although I hate this, I favor forming a commission here in Washington that could take a close look at it, particularly at the labor and environment elements, which have been largely ignored, contrary to the promises that were made. We've got to encourage ourselves to look at the reality of the unified labor market, which exists. We have to look, as the two presidents have already stated, about taking advantage of our new concerns about the environment. I was just in Mexico the other day, and we were talking about perhaps the creation of a North American carbon credit trading system. As we move into this territory, some of which is very new, why not do it trilaterally? And I think that's something we should look at. Fourth, I don't think we can try now to move for a comprehensive immigration reform. The time is not right. But the system is so, and I use this word advisedly, so vile that we should do something. And there are things that are relatively easy to do if there's political will and leadership: agricultural labor visas, raising the cap on the number of Mexicans who can move from illegal status to undocumented status to documented status. There's a tremendous backlog, as you all know, of people living in this country who've already been told, just wait, you're going to get your green card, but we only can give out, what is it, $100,000 a year or less. So wait 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, and meanwhile we'll count you as illegal and you'll be treated as illegal. So there are many interim steps that could be taken, and we shouldn't let the enemy, the best, be the enemy of the good. Let's move ahead. Fifthly, let's look ahead. We always get tied up in today's activities and today's problems. Right now, I think in these two administrations really ought to be focusing on problems that we're not talking about on a daily basis. One being water. I think anybody who looks at the Mexican-U.S. relationship has got to believe that over the next 4, 8, 12 years, conflict over water rights, water supplies, water quality is just going to grow. It ain't going to get better. So let's look at it now when there's a relative pause. Let's look at cross-border energy cooperation, particularly in alternative energy. I think we have to oblige to renegotiate or at least restudy some of the issues relating to oil exploration and production in the deep sea that's on our border. And finally, and then I'll stop, and this one is less specific and maybe tends towards the goody two-shoes kind of approach. But I do think we need political leadership that will encourage the kind of convivencia, the kind of cooperation at non-government level between universities and communities and people that was really growing very significantly in the years after NAFTA, as we say in Boston. I remember just before I went to Mexico in 1997, the National Geographic dedicated a whole issue to the frontier and talked about the frontier, the border, as being almost a third country, and by that obviously not a sovereign area, but full of a vibrancy, full of a cross-cultural animation that perhaps could be replicated elsewhere. Well, that no longer exists on the border. It's been much dissipated, and that hope of creating something else, which is largely fueled by private, non-governmental organizations, has disappeared. It's disappeared in our fears about terrorism. It's disappeared in our concerns about immigration. And while the work has to be done, not by government, it needs government to encourage it. So let me stop there. I talked too long. I apologize. It's a good report. I suggest you read it. There's a lot in there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'd like to turn it over now to Denise and to Andres, and I'd like you guys to kind of help as sort of political and opinion leaders to talk a little bit about how politically feasible some of this is. Some of what has been talked about in the report today on the Mexico side seems politically tricky. For example, the idea that Mexico needs to take more explicit steps to stop people from illegally crossing the border. How politically feasible is some of that? And on the United States side, we've talked some about, immigration reform and fears about immigration and concerns about drug violence in Mexico make sort of engagement with Mexico a politically tricky idea on this side of the border as well. So talk a little bit about, in your comments about the report as well, about how we turn some of these ideas into realities, whether it's possible soon, in the next 2 years, in the next 4 years. Denise, I'm sorry. Let's start with you, Denise. Sorry.
I will get to that, but I'd first like to take a moment to share my views as a Mexican in the current context on how I reacted to this report and how I link it to what's currently happening in my country. I'd like to commend the Woodrow Wilson Center for what is a very comprehensive, detailed, forward-looking, immensely practical report. Its emphasis on the strategy versus the tactical approach, a comprehensive view versus piecemeal initiatives, I think is very valuable. I agree with Ambassador Davido. Attention has been paid to Mexico, but not comprehensively enough, not coordinated enough. But I must confess that after reading this, I thought, we've been saying this and thinking along these lines for so many years. I mean, I've been a political scientist analyzing bilateral relations for 15 years. And the report outlines the dilemmas, the complexity, the challenges, the areas for potential collaboration, and it doesn't occur. So perhaps this is an appropriate moment for me to stress the urgency of the here and the now. related to what's happening in Mexico. And I don't want to join the list of the serious people who only focus on one issue that the ambassador suggested was not the right thing to do. But at the same time, I think it's important to sound the alarm about what is happening in Mexico. I don't mean to sound apocalyptic, and I don't want to be construed as a wailing Cassandra, but I am calling for a sober and realistic assessment. The debate in Mexico has focused, if anyone has been following the press over the last several weeks, the debate has focused on whether or not we are a failed state. And I agree with Ambassador Sarucán. If you look at the indicators of what constitutes a failed state, Mexico is very far from fulfilling any of those requirements to be categorized as such. But nonetheless, it's important that we recognize and admit that there is a spiraling amount of violence, crime, instability, particularly at the regional level, derived from drug trafficking. I do not view the failed state category as appropriate for Mexico, but nonetheless, I think it's important to say that Mexico has a weak, acorralado, cornered state, and that the debate over this issue captures the anxiety, the numbers and the intensity of the violence in Mexico at this point are staggering. And one reads about this in the paper every day, but I just want to tell you a personal anecdote that I think captures a bit of the situation. We read about these express kidnappings, and the numbers reveal that many Mexicans are exposed on a daily basis to random acts of violence and so on. Friday night, I go out to the movies with my husband. We're interrupted by a phone call from my mother, who's taking care of the children. My daughter has gone to a sleepover, and she has received a call saying that our daughter has been kidnapped. And there is a voice in the background that's crying, help me, and it's the sound of a young child. And for reasons that I will not go into, we couldn't reach my daughter at that moment because she was at a sleepover, and finally we did, after 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, I died. I frequently say that I'm only 25, I just look 45. Now I look 50. I died. And you know why I died? Because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to call. I didn't know if I called the police or whether the police were involved, if I called the delegada, if I called my friends in the government, if I called Ambassador Sarucán. And this may seem silly at some level, but it's not. It's deeply reflective of the incapacity of the Mexican government at multiple levels to fulfill its basic responsibility, which is to protect the lives of citizens, let alone their property. So what exactly is happening? I mean, the report takes a very comprehensive view on multiple issues: economic integration, border management, immigration. But I think that the key issue now has to be security collaboration, in my view. It has to become the short-term priority because it's becoming increasingly clear that Mexico cannot bear this burden alone. And the report is quite specific in the steps that it outlines, which I think are very valuable and should be highlighted. The report suggests, for example, law enforcement collaboration to disrupt money supplies and drugs and arms supplies. If you talk to the Mexican Attorney General, he will tell you this is the main headache that the Mexican government is dealing with today. 2,000 weapons cross the border to Mexico every day. And so if the U.S. government wants to start thinking seriously about its relationship with Mexico at this moment in time, this has to become a priority. Strengthening police and judicial institutions. This is more of a medium-term challenge. The reality of the situation in Mexico is that the Mexican state has become infiltrated by the forces it seeks to combat. You read about this on a daily basis. High-level officials who are hauled off to jail, based largely on American intelligence reports suggesting the level at which they have been co-opted and corrupted by the drug trade. I am one of those who believes that Calderón did not have a choice. I mean, he had to wage this war. But unfortunately, he has discovered that he doesn't have the necessary weapons to do so effectively. He's saddled with an ill-trained, corrupt police force, an army that is stretched too thin, an ineffectual judiciary, a penal system in which jails have become command and control centers for organized crime activities, including the instance of alleged kidnapping of my daughter, which I related to you. And I think the Mérida Initiative is simply not enough to deal with the dimension of the problem. It is not enough to make a dent in the magnitude of the problem. And I think that the conditions for assistance, for example, to the military, were diluted to a certain extent because of the concern voiced by, the recalcitrance voiced by members of the Mexican political elite who did not want conditionality attached. And I think that was ultimately harmful to the effort, as many people in the human rights community have underscored. So to finish, I think we're in a very paradoxical situation. Perhaps there has never been a greater need for strategic, collaborative thinking, but both governments at this point, Andrew suggested we have to start playing chess instead of checkers. The board is cracking. The board is falling apart. And yet at the same time, both governments are immersed in their own set of domestic challenges and domestic turmoil. In the U.S., we know it's domestic and financial. And in the Mexican case, it is today security related. Now, given the diagnosis that I've briefly laid out, Mexico should be a priority for U.S. foreign policy, but currently it is not. The staffing for key jobs related to Latin America in this administration has not even taken place. And on the government side, for political reasons, in an electoral year, Calderón cannot publicly recognize the severity of the problem, nor publicly request greater American aid for fear of being skewered by the opposition. And at this point, there is a lot of resentment vis-a-vis the U.S., broadly speaking, for not taking a more active stance in stopping just to give an example, stopping the flow of arms across the border. And I don't know if you saw an article in the New York Times 2 days ago. López Obrador, the vocal populist, a window of opportunity for him given the deteriorating economic situation. I think the story is way off. The story in Mexico today is the return of the PRI, of the former ruling party. And it's not the PRI of cosmopolitan Ferragamo tie-wearing techno-bureaucrats. It is the return of the vintage members of the dinosaurial class of the PRI, who are offering Mexicans, in the context of economic insecurity, they're sending the message, we knew how to do it. We knew how to govern. They're offering the oligarchs the maintenance of their monopolies. They're offering the businessmen a return to a semblance of security, pacting with drug trafficking organizations, as was the case in the past. They are offering the population a return to law and order. I call it the Putinization of Mexico. Similar to Russian sentiments in the aftermath of Yeltsin and a desire to sacrifice democratic liberties for the sake of reestablishing order. The insecurity situation in Mexico today is a symptom. It's a symptom of a deeper problem. Some of the things that Ambassador Davido alluded to. Mexico is not growing enough. Mexico does not have an economic development that encourages and allows social mobility. Mexico is, because of that, 400,000 people cross the border annually in search of opportunities they cannot find at home. It has a dysfunctional democracy in which we can celebrate electoral gains more people, more competitors compete in the political and electoral game, but the game itself has not changed. And that's the main reason why you're seeing the breakdown of institutions, the entrenched corruption, the way in which the political and economic game in Mexico has always been played, that continues to survive, except that the symptoms are becoming worse in the context of a weakened and cornered presidency. So I think that's what's at stake. When we look at this report, what we have to bear in mind is that Mexico is on the verge of a potentially regressive situation, politically speaking. And I think it's important for the U.S. to start thinking about that possibility strategically. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Andres, please.
Thank you, Ginger, and thank you to the Center for having me on such an august panel. And I just want to second the kudos to the folks who put together this report. As a member of a competing think tank in town, I'm kind of jealous of the quality of this and even like the graphics. So maybe I'll ask about who did the graphic design. But I did, on substance, want to second also the Denise's concept of paradoxes, and because one of the things that struck me in reading this and thinking about where the relationship is the degree to which Mexico is in a type of purgatory in terms of kind of the worldview from Washington and how we assess priorities. And I was also this harkens back to the ambassador's point about the relationship being stuck in the mud. I think in part it's because of this perception that Mexico exists in this kind of purgatory. It's neither in heaven nor hell from a kind of Washington perspective. And what I mean by that is, Mexico, as the report points out, is too rich to really be on the radar screen of kind of, the development assistance agencies in Washington. And yet it's too poor for us to be sharing a 2,000-mile border and not expect the kind of migration patterns that we're seeing and the tensions that evolve from that disparity. At the same time, Mexico is on the failed state debate. It's really, it's not a failed state, and it's absurd to suggest that. There's a certain stability there that allows people in Washington to think more about Pakistan and Afghanistan and plenty of other places. But at the same time, it's unstable enough that there is this horrific violence. So there's just a lot of areas where you have this tenuous balancing act, and things don't get radically better, but they're not bad enough that we have to prioritize the relationship. And that's frustrating. To Denise's point about we have had these discussions for a long time. And I don't know what to wish for, because I certainly don't wish for Mexico to become a failed state so that we can stop worrying about Pakistan and have to worry more about Mexico. So as a PR matter, I don't know what to do with this, because obviously it's Ambassador Sarucan's job to reassure us that the Mexican government is on the case and things are okay. On the other hand, he also wants Washington to pay more attention to Mexico. And as everybody in the news business knows, if it bleeds, it leads. So, in a way, if Ambassador Sarucan wants us to pay more attention to Mexico, he should get on the failed state bandwagon. But he might lose his job, so I don't know where that leads. But so I think it's all the more important for institutions like ours, New America Foundation and the Woodrow Wilson Center and plenty of other folks to try to flesh out what the reality is in terms of the relationship. And one of the things that I really liked about the report was that it did seem grounded in reality, as others have mentioned. And it's very commonsensical. In particular, and this reflects my own bias, I like the fact that it fleshes out the reality of the immigration dilemmas, but moves forward in the sense of delinking the notion that immigration is a inherently diplomatic affair. Obviously, the United States, I've been involved in another roundtable on immigration in town, and I was getting frustrated at the degree to which people were talking about immigration without, underscoring the uniqueness of the Mexico piece of the pie, and what I sort of was calling Mexican exceptionalism in that context, where everybody in D.C. is in some roundtable or panel, as David Brooks's column the other day said, that on any given Saturday, half the people in D.C. are making plans for panels for the other half. But that's an aside. So, one of our fellows at New America, who's doing some work with us as a sort of adjunct fellow, is Jorge Castañeda, and he and I have disagreed about the degree to which there may have been a backlash in the early Bush days of treating American, immigration policy as a bilateral relationship, and the optics of that, and the perception that this was a form of aid or a favor being done to another country, as opposed to something that was driven by sort of U.S. economic interest, and what that meant in terms of the talk radio dynamic and the Lou Dobbs. So I like the fact that this report talks about you can't really deal with this issue without having more communication. At the same time, there are important sovereignty considerations on both sides of the border. Lastly, one thing I think will be very interesting to watch going forward is the degree. I see the potential for a collision between, on the one hand, the goodwill that folks in Latin America and other parts of the world feel towards the Barack Obama as an individual and the new administration, and on the other hand, the sort of protectionist message that's coming out of Washington, and how there seems to be those two forces seem to be on a collision course, and part of it is not Obama's doing, to the extent that he has to react to things coming out of the Congress. Although, as the ambassador pointed out, there was also a dynamic during the primaries. Some of that's being corrected. This has always been there, but I think one of the things that makes it particularly acute now is the degree to which people in the developing world, and particularly countries like Mexico that are more middle-income countries, are suffering the effects of financial contagion that is coming from the U.S. So sort of the world's upside down if you compare what's happening today from the 90s, where the rest of the world had to cope with fallouts from financial implosions in Russia or Turkey or Mexico. And I was joking with somebody the other day that if that was the tequila effect in the mid-90s, now I guess we can call it the Budweiser effect, in the sense that this is a crisis made in the U.S. And to what degree we're going to see a backlash as people in Russia and Brazil and Mexico have their living standards affected by the failure of Washington and Wall Street to practice what it was preaching. The Mexican government in the last decade, as many of these other countries did, got their houses in order as a result of the crises in the 90s in terms of macroeconomic policy. This report points to that. We had balanced budgets, and countries like Mexico and Brazil have more or less lived within their means compared to the U.S. Now you have a peso that's devaluating, and people are going to suffer another slump, and this time it's because of this failure in the U.S. So how that's going to square with this narrative coming out of Washington that American workers are suffering because of unfair competition, and those foreign workers are taking away our jobs and playing unfairly. I worry about that, and Obama does have quite a reservoir of goodwill and capital, so that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. But I do want to just applaud the sentiment of this report. I think we're going to have more engagement, and it is going to be on, issues like, can we all overcome some of our sovereignty hangups and work more closely together on security? But on the PR front, I'm going to leave that to Ambassador Sadouk Khan to try to get this relationship to loom larger in Washington without him having to get on the failed state bandwagon.
Thank you. Typically as a journalist, the biggest challenge I have is extracting sort of interesting and insightful commentary from the people I interview, and you guys have made my job very easy today. Thank you very much for those comments. I think because in the interest of time, I'd like to open the floor to any of you who may have questions for the panel before continuing on. I see a hand in the back. I see a hand in the front. I see lots of hands. Let me start in the front and work my way back, if that's okay with you. And can we keep the questions short, please? We don't have much time. And also, panelists, would you please keep your answers short as well? So, yes, sir.
Paul Rich, Policy Studies Organization. It was a wonderful panel, but I think many of us will take away Professor Dresser's remarks as filling in some of the areas. I think, therefore, I'd ask you if you don't feel that a great many of the things which happen to people in Mexico go unreported. I've been kidnapped twice, and they were quick kidnappings for cash, one in front of Sanborns and Reforma, and I didn't go to the police because my kidnappers were dressed as police. So, they made the point that they wanted the cash machine to work because they had an 18-inch screwdriver sharpened to a point, which they drove in the thigh of my teaching assistant. Now, those were two incidents which weren't reported. So I think the situation, without going into more anecdotes, is much worse than people think. And I was a little querulous about Mr. Martinez's point. Maybe not a failed state in Brookings statistics, but certainly, Mr. Martinez, in the perception of many of us who've gone there for many years, a failing state.
Thank you. I'm going to go for another question and then take answers. There's a gentleman here and then behind him. Let's take 3 questions and then we'll do some answers, okay?
Thank you also for the wonderful panel. I had a reaction to the report, and it seems to start with the acceptance of the idea that criminalizing the consumption of drugs is a sound approach. And I wanted to ask about the panel's reaction to the reports of parents starting at that particular point.
Great. Thank you. And one more question, and then we'll begin to take answers. Thank you.
Yeah, my question, this is Ann Wakefield, Grupo Radio Centro, and my question is in the sense of some very sound minds in Mexico also suggesting something that is going to sound outrageous, but that might help to end the one thing that, at least in Hobbesian terms, is what makes a state work, which is to protect its citizens from having a violent death. And this is to legalize the consumption of drugs. What do you think of that?
Okay, so 2 questions on decriminalizing drug consumption. Anybody? Takers on the panel? Oh, come on, Jeff.
Yeah.
Let me try to answer that question by basically saying it's a debate that everyone in this room has been in at least 100 times, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I don't think we have the time to get into right now. My personal view is that every state has an obligation to protect the health and welfare of its citizens. And it's a cliche. Drugs are illegal because they're really bad for people. They're not bad for people because they're illegal. Now, that doesn't mean we can't take a look at some elements of what is illegal and should marijuana be treated in the same way as crack cocaine and so forth. I did not sit on this panel. I've sat on others, and the Brookings Institution did a report on Latin America not long ago, and I was on that. And basically, we just decided not to handle the question of legalization or decriminalization because it would have really ripped the commission apart and probably not come up with anything that would be new or particularly useful. So I don't deprecate those questions. I just think we really can't handle them in this forum. Let me say one thing which, on the question of your point on violence and Denise's truly frightening story in experience. And this will sound a bit harsh. There is no question that the concern about security in Mexico, which goes well beyond the fighting between drug cartels and the horrendous stories of decapitations and what have you, is something that is actually now a part of the life of almost every Mexican that I know. And in places that one would not have thought, provincial capitals and what have you. It is the top concern. However, the purpose of this discussion today, the purpose of this report, is to talk about the U.S.-Mexican relationship. And it is one of the conceits that always slips into our discussions of Mexico, is that, well, gee, we may have a very important role in changing what's going on there. I think we cannot deny the responsibility of the United States in terms of a market for drugs, a sales point for guns. But the fact of the matter is, not much of what the United States is going to do in the short term is going to have an impact on this horrendous growth of insecurity. And I just say that because it's hard for people in government to sort of recognize a general inability to control events. We have to focus on it, but let's not fool ourselves that we're going, at least in the United States, we're going to solve it.
Is there anyone else on the panel? Yes, Denise.
And Denise will disagree.
No. I think your point is well taken. I rarely write about security issues as part of the bilateral relationship. I tend to focus on what Mexico needs to do to clean up its own house. And as a result, most of my work has been on the structural obstacles that impede growth in Mexico, on the structure of the economy and the political rules that perpetuate that structure, on monopolies, on lack of regulation, on absence of competition, on lack of transparency in economic transactions, on Mexico's various forms of crony capitalism. So I do believe that it's our responsibility to deal with those issues, and also with something that has become I think a crucial obstacle to Mexican reform, and it has to do with the ingrained corruption within Mexican institutions. And the U.S. cannot help Mexico solve its problem beyond suggesting best practices, providing training, assistance. But for that to change in Mexico, a substantive amount of political will would be required. And it's a political will that President Calderon has not shown, I think, due to the constraints of the political system he lives in. He needs the collaboration of the former ruling party in order to get reforms approved in Congress. So he has basically said, I'm not going to take on the issue of corruption that the PRI is emblematic of, because otherwise I cannot get these people to the table to negotiate reforms in Congress. And that's one of the reasons that explains the comeback of the former ruling party. but it creates an extraordinary amount of cynicism and incredulity on the part of a Mexican population that sees its leaders gathered together to sign an accord, el acuerdo por la legalidad y la justicia, to take on the insecurity issue. And it's signed by Mario Marin, the governor of Puebla, involved in the protection of the trafficking of children. It is signed by Ulises Ruiz, under investigation for atrocities committed in Oaxaca. It is signed by Romero de Champs, union leader who has siphoned off public funds into private ventures. And therefore, this sends out, I think, an important, powerful, and undermining message for rule of law issues. And that's why 99% of crimes in Mexico are not reported and they're not solved. There is a basic culture of impunity. I always say that I insist on being a good citizen con todo en contra. Mm-hmm. I do go and denounce things. I mean, when I received death threats after the election, I went to the Ministerio Público and I spent 5 days there denouncing the case, and there was never a solution. So in a response to your question as to what happens to ordinary people, well, they face dysfunctional institutions that do not have the capacity to deal with their demands or solve them. And going back to your quotation about Hobbes, unfortunately, for many people in Mexico, life has become nasty, brutish, and short. Thank you.
How about a few more questions, please? I want to get to some of the people I saw in the back. I see David there, please. David Brooks. And the gentleman in the very back. We'll take 2 or 3 more questions and then some answers, please.
This David Brooks of La Jornada, the real David Brooks. One of the things that has not been mentioned is, in these same rooms about 15 years ago, we were told that NAFTA would be the solution to almost every single one of the problems that have been mentioned in this report or on this panel. We were told that the free market and privatization and liberalizing trade and all the things that make up elements of what was then to be the model for the rest of the hemisphere through the Washington Consensus. The question now is, given the crisis in the United States, what Paul Krugman, a type of lemon socialism now taking place over free market values, given that this model is now in question inside the United States, in Washington, what are the premises for convincing my readers as to what the next consensus should look like, and why would anybody in Mexico think that a strategic relationship once again would now this time be different than before in the context of this crisis?
Thank you. One more question I see in the back, and then I'll get some in the front.
Thank you. Rodrigo Aguilar from the Washington Center. I'm asking for an answer, sober, realistic, and honest. Do you have identified in this report or during your research who actually benefits from the current situation? Which groups? Both sides, United States and Mexico.
And then can I take a couple of questions right here in the front, and then we'll have some answers.
Raul Rodriguez, Arizona State University. I can fully relate to what Denise mentioned. I had a gun pointed to my head in front of my children, and unless I'm delusional, I'm still here. And by the way, I was more scared when the police arrived. I can attest to that. The question is, going back to what you said, Denise, in terms of the fundamental challenge perhaps being structural reforms in Mexico, or whatever we want to call them these days. Structural reform is a no-no in terms of a political term in Mexico these days. But anyhow, going back to that, what are the odds of that moving forward in the new political context coming up with the PRI perhaps gaining ground?
And then this is the gentleman next to you, and then we'll take answers, please.
Thank you. I'm Luigi Einaudi, ex of the State Department and the Organization of American States, now over at the National Defense University, where obviously people are worried about the kind of situation that Denise is. articulated brilliantly. And where one of my concerns has been to say, well, we're not comfortable with Mexico, but remember the Mexicans aren't comfortable with us. The concept of the playing board being cracked is a marvelous image, and it's one that allows the image to go from Mexico to the United States and from the United States to Mexico. It's the question of the rules of the game under which we can cooperate to do some of these things and perhaps overcome concerns, cultural concerns, sovereignty concerns, and the rest. My question is very simple. Can the law help?
Okay. Let's start. Would someone take David's question on the strategic partnership and why, we should believe now that there's a new way of engagement that will benefit Mexico? You see?
I'm much more fluent when I speak in Spanish, so I will break the discipline, and I would like to ask Katie to help us with the translation. Creo que, como bien lo dijo el embajador David O., NAFTA, aunque ha sido un instrumento útil para ambos países, mi estado, Michoacán, es un ejemplo de que en ciertos sectores o para ciertos sectores ha sido muy importante, para otros no tanto, ha tenido un efecto doble, pero es un instrumento cuyos beneficios no han llegado, no han sido percibidos por la mayor parte de la población. Creo que está claro en este momento que esta alianza estratégica de la que se habla entre los dos países no puede reducirse o no puede centrarse exclusivamente en los aspectos comerciales. Hay muchas otras cosas que hacer de las que aquí se ha hablado. Hay que transformar, creo que es el reto principal, al tratado o a la relación de estar centrada en el aspecto pues puramente comercial, a ser un elemento para el desarrollo de la gente, en beneficio de la gente, tangible, que eleve su condición de vida. Y no sé si estoy yendo muy largo. Adelante, adelante.
Is it necessary? I would imagine most in this crowd, but we should translate some. Okay, great. Katie.
Okay. Lázaro says that without a doubt, NAFTA has certainly helped certain sectors of the Mexican economy. His state of Michoacán is evidence of this, but by and large, the Mexican population has not seen the benefits of NAFTA. And what this means is that the bilateral relationship and the strategic partnership that we talk about cannot be focused exclusively on trade, and that we have to move from trade exclusively to development, to creating tangible benefits of the relationship that average Mexicans can see.
Y por otra parte, pero relacionado con la pregunta de David, ¿cómo convencer aquí de la necesidad y de la importancia de encauzar la relación de otra manera, o nuevamente relanzar con prioridad, con relevancia, con importancia la relación entre nuestros países? Pues creo desafortunadamente que la gravedad de lo que ocurre en México pues es la manera, si no se puede en este momento, no sé cuándo, de convencer de la necesidad de hacer las cosas de otro modo, de repensar, de relanzar la relación desde la perspectiva, como bien lo sugiere el reporte, de la cooperación, de la interdependencia, de entender que los fenómenos transfronterizos no pueden ser abordados unilateralmente. Creo que desafortunadamente esa situación crítica, no necesariamente de un Estado fallido, pero sí de un Estado vulnerable, al crimen, vulnerable también a la acción de los poderes fácticos al interior de las instituciones, pues es la llamada más clara a que repensemos las cosas por la seguridad de ambos países y particularmente, en este caso, por la seguridad de Estados Unidos, un país tan preocupado por este tema, incluso cuando se trata de amenazas mucho más lejanas que la que se tiene aquí cerca.
The question is how to get people in the United States and government officials in the United States to pay more attention and to put more of an emphasis on its relationship with Mexico. And unfortunately, the gravity of the situation of organized crime and security threats may be the best opportunity that we have in Washington to start paying more attention. The question of how do you move, or the importance of moving from unilateral solutions and working more with Mexico, security may be the most clear and urgent call to do so, particularly when the United States is willing to pay attention to security threats coming from much farther away than from Mexico.
Very well. Good. There were questions about the odds of this happening, the odds of structural change in Mexico. Denise, do you want to address that, or was
there were several questions raised about NAFTA? I think NAFTA was and is an instrument to promote trade and investment, and viewed through that lens, as Sidney Weintraub's work has underscored, NAFTA has been a success, but it could not in and of itself solve the problems of Mexico's development model that were pre-existent to NAFTA. The deep-rooted inequalities, the concentration of income, the lack of credit for small and medium-sized businesses, a social policy that had good intentions but bad results, as Santiago Levy's important work on how broad-based subsidies have led to incentives for informality in Mexico. NAFTA cannot and should not be blamed for the lack of substantive reform in Mexico's political economy. I know your readers in La Jornada will say, well, the problem was neoliberal reform. And I would say, no, the problem was not enough liberalism in Mexico's economic reform package. There was privatization, there was deregulation, there was state retrenchment, but it wasn't accompanied by good, adequate government regulation to construct functional, competitive markets for consumers. Instead, we saw simply the way in which public monopolies were passed into private hands, and the incorporation of new players into the economy, but with the same sort of discretionary, behind-the-scenes rules and negotiations that have plagued Mexico's economy for so many years. So I think now the U.S. is moving, as we know, and as Paul Krugman has suggested, into a new model that will entail greater regulation, greater state intervention, with the idea of reestablishing a more adequate balance between state and market. And this is something that Mexico should applaud and actually strive for in its own context.
any other commentary?
I guess, can I say something?
Absolutely, Andres.
I can't help but think about the another strategic partnership between your newspaper, my former newspaper, and Carlos Slim when the issue is about monopolies and structural change. And I mean, I think the investment of Mr. Slim in the New York Times is it was kind of it's a very interesting indicator of how Mexico just is not center stage in terms of what media and public intellectual elites and government elites in this country consider to be places that matter. I mean, my first instinct was to feel some Mexican pride that this newspaper that I respect so much, had to go to Mexico to safeguard its viability and independence. On the other hand, I found it kind of insulting at the end of the day that there's this notion that that was a safe place to go and make this arrangement with a tycoon because there's this perception that there's not going to be a conflict of interest in terms of the coverage of news. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, the New York Times would never have struck such a deal with a Russian billionaire monopolist or Israeli or Chinese or Iraqi or would not have sought out that conflict from any place that matters journalistically. So to the extent that we in this country are focused on whether there's going to be structural change in Mexico, I think that was kind of a worrisome trend, deal in terms of really clarifying where that story ranks in terms of the priorities. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the plight of the newspaper industry. That's a whole separate panel, and the need to get capital, and this made sense as a business matter. But the notion that you could make a deal with somebody who controls 7% of Mexico's GDP and not get into sort of journalistic conflicts of interest, and that this could preserve the independence of the newspaper, I think was a telling moment.
Well, as much as I'd like to debate Mexico's importance to the New York Times, which I devoted 6 years of my life to, I will end on that very comfortable note and thank the panel for a terrific discussion. Thank you.
Let me join Ginger and all of you in thanking this panel. We're very grateful for them taking time to be here, all of you for joining us, and for our colleagues in the press.